Well, good morning to you. It's time to begin, and we're certainly happy to have opportunity to meet on the Lord's Day and worship. And glad everyone is here. We are missing several, but David, okay? Is he getting his mama? Okay. Brother Richard is back, and Lee's not well, but anyway, we're glad to be with each one. Our readings this morning, private readings, are from 1 Chronicles 7 through 1 Chronicles 14. 1 Chronicles 7 through 14. We'll go through fairly quickly, get right on into the life of Jesus, a lot to cover. And all right, so we want to remember 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And whereas the Kings deal primarily with the kings, both northern and southern, Chronicles emphasizes what? The southern kings, as well as the Levitical priest, the things that were going on that related to the Messianic promises, really, David's house. And so we pointed out, if you'll just notice real quickly, 1 Chronicles 1 starts with Adam. It goes on down to Jacob in chapter 2, Jacob down to David, and then 3, the descendants of Judah, David, Judah and Simeon. We just keep going until we get to chapter 7, this sons of who in 7? Verse 1, Issachar, and then 6, verse 6, Benjamin, and Manasseh, or Naphtali 13, Manasseh 14, Ephraim 20. Some of their possessions are mentioned later on in chapter 8. Benjamin. I was going to mention something that I didn't just a moment ago. If you were thinking about the major outline of the book, really the first 9 chapters give the lineage of David. And then in 10 through 29, the reign of David. Both 1st and 2nd Chronicles were likely written after the captivity and actually after the return. Because in 2nd Chronicles, good to see you, Sister Sandra, Brother Farron, glad you're well enough to be with us at least. We're glad you're here. I know it's hard for you. You look like you're a little dizzy. I'm sorry. 2nd Chronicles, the last few verses end where Ezra begins. And so possibly Ezra wrote it, but it deals with the time after the Medo-Persians allowed the Jews to return. And so Chronicles seems to be written for the express purpose of emphasizing the fact that though Israel for their whole history had been unfaithful, God was faithful to his promises. And he would spare that remnant and keep the Davidic promises alive, or the promises, the Abrahamic promises through Judah, and then the Davidic promises and on through. And a remnant would survive. So in those passages, again, we got a little bit off track, but in 1 through 9, the genealogies that show David all the way back to Adam. And then Naphtali, chapter 7, and Benjamin in 8, 9. It's interesting, if you look at chapter 9, verse 1, so all Israel were reckoned by genealogies, and behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel, and Judah was carried away captive to Babylon for their what?
Breach of faith.
Yes, their transgression, their breach of faith, and then in the people are spoken of as who returned. And then in chapter 10 through 29, who's under discussion? We mentioned a while ago, 10 through 29, the reign of David. That's right. And chapter 11, David becomes king over all Israel. He reigned first at what city? Hebron, for about how many years? About 7. And then he made Jerusalem the headquarters. He brought the Ark of the Covenant there. David's mighty men are identified in chapter 11. And then some of those people who are close to David in 12, and then the numbering. In chapter 13 through 17, we have a whole section of Chronicles given over to the bringing up into Jerusalem of what? The Ark of the Covenant. Exactly right. And it's interesting, in 13, they care. If you look down in verse 6, 13:6, David went up all Israel to Baalah, that is to Kiriath Jearim, which belongs to Judah, to bring up from thence the ark of God, Jehovah, that sitteth upon or above the cherubim, that is called by thy name. And they carried the ark of God upon a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio drove the cart. And we know what happened there. They came to the threshing floor, and the oxen stumbled, and what happened? Uzzah touched it, and he died. And it's an interesting idea that we got some of David's family listed in chapter 14. And so into chapter 15, which is really where we'll be today, getting a little ahead, they end up doing things the right way by prescription. And it's interesting that when they find out, hey, we should take this on the shoulders of the priest and particular family. You notice in 15:11, David called Zadok and Abiathar the priest for the Levites, for Uriel and others, and said, "Ye are the heads of the fathers' houses. Sanctify yourselves, both you and your brethren, that you may bring up the ark." Look at verse 13. "For because you bear it not at the first, Jehovah our God made a breach upon us, for that we sought him not according to the," what does your translation have? To the rule. What's your?
Ordinance.
To the ordinances. The King James says according to the what? Due order. The due order. All of those things mean one and the same. They just simply didn't do it like God wanted them to do it. And we've made the point as we've gone through the whole Bible that any sin is wrong. But when people access God in worship and they take a fast and loose attitude toward it, that just seems to bring out the wrath of God more quickly. Think Nadab and Abihu and Uzziah when he offered priest, he was from Judah rather than Levi. And here in the case where they've done several things wrong, they're transporting on a cart, and none of that was right. And so God showed his displeasure. We'll pick up, Lord willing, there a little later. Any comment or question on it? Yes, sir.
I was going to ask something about 16, the first verse. So they brought the ark of God and set it in the midst of the tabernacle that David had erected for it. Is that the same tabernacle that they used in the wilderness?
Yes. And by this time, it would have been about over 500 years old.
Yeah. That's what
And you think about a structure that had linen,
Animal
leather.
skins.
What's that?
Animal skins.
Animal skins. I was thinking leather or animal skins that were a part of the roof, and it fell. A lot of it was at Shiloh for a long time. It fell in disrepair, and you can imagine a tent-like structure out in the elements all the time that it would do that after a while. You look like you wanted to say something.
I can imagine God making it shine the whole time.
Yeah, he could have. That's right. Exactly right.
Well, I just can't help but think, when they were wandering in the wilderness in their clothing, he took
Yeah,
care of
clothes.
He took care of them.
He took
so,
care.
like Brother Gene said, God knew what he wants to do.
He could. That's exactly right.
But it was another example of those who think they were doing right, and what it seemed to be right to move the ark,
Yeah.
and it wasn't what God
Yeah,
expected.
exactly. It's not according to the due order. Yeah. There's a way, it's interesting in so many areas of life. If someone, especially sports, if someone does something to disqualify themselves, it's said, well, that's okay. Their heart was right. No. If a person, I guess, running cross country with a Cooper, if they get out of, then you're disqualified. It's not a case, well, he meant well. No, you do things according to the order that's here, and it's doable, but you have to stay within the
I think
confines.
about so many religious people today, in their mind, they think we doing what we need to do
Yeah.
to please God. and it would. It's not according to his pattern.
Yeah, well, so much worship is about me, what I feel, what pleases me, rather than, well, let's please God, you know, what's God said. And it's just like, I've used the illustration several times. Here's an anniversary. Does the husband get his wife what the husband wants or what the wife wants? You try to please the party you adore. And the same is true with worship. Worship is basically, I remember reading this, and I've used it myself, that worship is, in a sense, one step past love. And I don't know if that's technically correct, but it expresses the idea. So,
That
yes, sir.
question you asked depends on how much peace you want to keep in the house.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, it's always been interesting to me that they built the tabernacle and had one legitimate Passover feast, and then, best I can tell, they
They didn't keep it
operate that way any of the rest of the 40 years.
for 39 more years.
And
Yeah.
they didn't circumcise their children.
Exactly.
And then when they went into the land, they mentioned a couple other times when they discovered the law, they had maybe 3 Passovers, Hezekiah, Josiah,
Yes.
and when they crossed the river with Joshua.
Then it was like a new thing.
Yeah, and it didn't, by the time of Jesus, it seemed to be ritualized.
Yes, yeah, very, very ritualized. Yeah, you're right. By Joshua, the 5th chapter, when they actually are they're ready to cross and go on in, and they do cross. And then 6, is the taking of Jericho, the first city. But Brother Gene's right. They circumcise their children. That hadn't been practiced. They take the Passover, and then the manna stops after 40 years. And significant things, but it's easy for people to let go what divine ordinances are that are plain. We were brought up Thursday morning. Someone brought up about the United Methodist and how they've had, here in Alabama, a huge split due to what some progressives wanted to do versus the women in preaching and the same-sex couples and all that, versus the others and basically left and started another church. I had it reversed when I said Thursday morning. The global United Methodists are the ones who actually are the more conservatives among them. And then the United Methodists are the ones who've gone out and basically anything goes. But when you make up the rules on your own, then it's all subject to the whims of whatever people want. If we simply say, it's not what I'm thinking, it's let's just go back and try to examine the scripture and do the best we can to handle it accurately, and then let's stay to that. So it's not a church ordinance, it's not what rules we make, it's what the Lord has already made. And that's the difference really between New Testament Christianity and denominationalism. New Testament Christianity, every other religious group. Comment, question?
Every time they've made their own rules, it's not been good.
It's not been good. No, that's right. Okay, let's move on then and get into the life of Jesus. Here we are, the main section, the years of preparation, the beginning ministry, 2 years in Galilee, and then they follow him for the wrong reasons, many do. So we have the retirement from the crowds, and then he comes closing in Jerusalem, Judea and Perea in the closing ministry. And then the last week, really technically, as I've got on this note here, his last week is only referring to the earthly ministry, and it's a little bit more than a week. It's basically about 10 days. And we've got so much in these chapters, so many chapters actually, that are dealing with just a few days. And I mentioned that in this note. Often the Bible covers many years in a few chapters. Here there are many chapters given to simply a few days, due to its being the centerpiece of the Bible story. All right, and here we've had Jesus arriving at Bethany, and in whose house are they when Mary? I just told you, didn't I? They're in Simon's house. What was Simon formerly? A what? A leper. And who objects to Mary's anointing Jesus? Was it
Judas.
Judas. And then Day of Triumph. And remember the three things they did. They're singing Hosanna to the Son of David, quoting from Psalm 118. They have put their clothes on as he's riding a colt. And then the third thing, they've cut down palm branches and put those in his way, so showing their honor. However, were they really, as we see, maybe some of them were, but were they really honoring him as a spiritual Messiah? They were looking for a physical, temporal, national Messiah, national king, and Jesus simply didn't fit the bill of what they were looking for. So here we are, Sunday, Day of Triumph, and then he showed his authority on Monday by cursing the fig tree, and then once he got into the city, cleansing the temple. And then on Tuesday, which is where we are, day of tremendous conflict, and the disciples find the fig tree withered. His authority who gave you this authority? By whom? By whose authority do you do these things? His challenge, he gave the three warning parables, the parable of the two sons, the parable of the wicked husbandman, and then in Matthew 22, the parable of the marriage feast. And then the entrapment questions are answered. The Pharisees and the Herodians, is it lawful to give tribute to Caesar? Second question, Sadducees said, what about a man who's married and he dies? And then the big question was, in the resurrection, whose will she be? And he answered that. And then his question they could not answer, what think ye of the Christ? Whose son is he? They said the son of David. And he quoted from what psalm? You tell me, what psalm did he quote from? 110 verse 1. Good. The Lord said unto my Lord, what? Sit thou on my right hand till I make thine enemies the footstool of thy feet. And they could, if he is his Lord, how is he his son? And they could not get that idea he would be both human and divine. Then the woes against the scribes and Pharisees that we talked about last week. And then we finished up Wednesday night on the widow's mites. Jesus watched the people as he's still here in the temple proper. And the Pharisees and others cast in much. They cast in much. She cast in 2 mites, which was a 64th of a day's wage. Basically $1 to $2 in our currency. But she cast in what Jesus said, more than they all, because she cast in even of her living, whereas they just gave a token from their surplus or their abundance. And Jesus shows, he knows if we give, what we give is from our superfluity, what's surplus, left over, abundant, or if it's sacrificially. And we've talked about this. This is where we ended Wednesday night. Riches tell little about our spirituality. We can be hypocritical in our contribution. Would we be embarrassed for others to know what we contribute? Jesus watched and knew. He knows what we give, and it's proportional to what we have to give, as well as what we have left over after we give. And pointed that out. That his deity, his omniscience is again revealed. Now, this is where we didn't get, and I wanted to just finish this up and then get into Matthew 24. Lessons relative to giving from other scriptures. We oftentimes, after the Lord's Supper and giving, somebody will quote a portion of 1 Corinthians 16, 2, or maybe 2 Corinthians 9, 7 and 8. And those are passages certainly that are appropriate, but the New Testament does teach on giving. And while we're on that, just remind us of a few things. While the Old Testament taught tithing, or it did teach tithing, while the New Testament does not teach tithing, it does teach that our contribution should be on the first day of the week, as regular, frequent. Some translations say upon the first day of every week. Let each one of you lay by him in store as he may prosper. Let each one. In other words, can anybody give for me? No. It's an individual responsibility. And I made a point in lessons on this. It's good for us to teach our young people to give, starting out early. If you mow your yard, or you sweep something, or you babysit for somebody, and you make a little money, get used to giving a portion of it. Let each one of you lay by him in store. That word, English word store, comes from a Greek word from which we get thesaurus, a treasury. You know what a thesaurus is. What is it? That's right. It's like a dictionary of synonyms of words, and so it's a storehouse, a storage, planned, purposed, and into a treasury. So it's laid by him. There's a determination there, and then here, as he may prosper, we look at what we have, and we make a proportion to what our livelihood is. And then Paul said, in particularly there in 1 Corinthians 16, that no collections be made when I come. He was going to come and take up collections and carry it back where? To Jerusalem for the needy saints there. But in a sense, but he also said in 1 Corinthians 16:1, now concerning the collections for the saints, as I gave order to the churches of Galatia, so also do ye. And so this was universal teaching, not just related to the Corinthians. Treasuries in local churches should be available for ongoing, planned, as well as special needs. And I think we do that here. There are other things. Treasury for local churches is evident from 1 Corinthians 16. Lay by him in store. If you think of the word storage, that makes it easy to remember. Lay by him in store. Lay into a storage, a treasury. The reason that you think, well, Philip, that sounds like, that's kind of, making a mountain out of a molehill, isn't it? I have come across more brethren than you realize who deny that local churches need to have a treasury. They say, well, we just give when there's a need. And the answer to that, I remember reading where a brother in times past said, well, I believe the same thing you, that we just need to give when we have a need. I just believe we have more needs than you do. We have needs going on all the time. But anyway, a treasury is authorized. Even among the apostles, who held the bag? Judas. Yeah, they have a little treasury among them. And so a treasury is evident from Acts 2:40. Everybody in this room can quote that. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. Fellowship by most is under the sharing. Well, what did they share? Well, they shared time, shared worship, and they shared their goods, as is evident from the latter part, verses 44 and 45. In 11, 27, and 30, the brethren at Antioch determined to send relief to the brethren who were in Judea, which also they did, sending it by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So you had a collectivity of the funds. And then it's implied in those passages. And then in Philippians 4, Paul said, no church had fellowship with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but ye only. For even in Thessalonica, you sent once again unto my need. You sent once again. Here's Philippi, Thessalonica. So here is a congregation sending. Well, that implies there's something done as a whole there. And this is in addition, all this is in addition to private, benevolent, evangelistic, emergency purposes. I believe, sometimes people say, here's a need that arises, and somebody asks, could you help us do this? Well, I give on the first day of the week. That's kind of like, is there a benevolent need? Well, I pay my taxes. Let the government take care of it. This is in addition to private. In Acts 4, there was a particular emergency that arose. What was it? Anybody?
Famine in the land.
Well, famine, and the people who had been there in Jerusalem for a while were without. And so people began, now, see, this is the reason I say it, is these are emergency needs over the plan. Remember, somebody had a certain field and sold it and brought the proceeds and laid it at the apostles' feet. Of whom do we speak? Barnabas. Barnabas. Now, you can't keep selling your fields and your houses. I mean, there's a limited amount of that. And so here are emergency needs. And even in chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira had a field and sold it and brought. The problem with them was they just lied about it. But in Ephesians 4:28, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him work with his hands what is right, that he might have what? To give to, y'all heard me quote that enough, you can see it in your sleep, can't you? Say it in your sleep. That they might have need, and they have whereof to give him that hath need. Yeah. And so that's important. Then 1 Timothy 5, we have the widows, and who are widows indeed, and then some who are widows who are not widows indeed, that have family to take care of. And so there are family responsibilities that come. But anyway, I just thought I would mention some of that. Comment or question?
I was thinking about the occasion. I can't remember anything in the law of Moses that said they had to put the collection out for public perusal. You know, they had to give a certain portion of their sacrifices,
Right,
and a certain portion of their income, the 10%.
right,
And all that transaction took place between the people offering the sacrifice and the priest.
and the priest, yeah.
And so I think this is just another display for the benefit of the religious hierarchy.
Yeah.
So they could put on their phylacteries
And enlarge the borders of the garment. Yeah.
and strut by there and put in a big check or something.
Yes, to be seen. That's exactly right. One thing I do want to mention about this, that I have been kind of privy to some information in places where we've been. I'm thinking about a fella when we were in Athens. The church parking lot needed resurfacing. It had been, and it was going to cost about $12,000–13,000 to get it done. And a fellow who was retired, and he had been an engineer for a number of years. He'd done well, and the elders mentioned that, you know, this is going to cost us. We think we can do it, but we'd really not like to have to cut any of the outside support we give preachers. And he came to the elders privately and said, just tell me how much it is, I'll write a check for it. You can't help but love people like that, appreciate them so much that you know, they want to help the cause. And if it's kind of a need, a special need that they can supply, then do that. And I think that's a good lesson for all of us. That Brother Billy Lovely, Wes, said one time, he told me, he said, Brother Philip, I learned a long time ago, you can never outgive God. And he was a giving man in a lot of different ways. But
Because we had a sister here that did that when we restriped the parking lot.
yes,
She brought
yeah.
the checks. I don't nobody know this, but I want to give this toward that.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I found out just not long ago that there was a sister up in Athens who died, and she had a fairly nice house, and she ended up giving it to the fellow and his wife who were preaching where she was. And they lived in a preacher's house. The church owned the house, and she just wanted them to have the equity, and you know, she gave them the house. I'm not saying that y'all need to do that for me. We already got our own, but I just, you know, just get us to think outside the box. They're great examples of people, but I'm certain that that's been done here. I'm just unaware of it, and I appreciate people like that. Any other comment or question? Yes, sir.
Just you know, kind of thinking through this, and then kind of thinking toward our study later on this morning. There are very specific things to do with our giving. We've been told exactly what to do and what not to do,
Yeah.
and how to do it.
Yes.
Not only how to use that money, the treasury,
Yeah.
but how our heart should be as well.
Yes, the planning, the proposing, the purposing.
And when we think of other acts of worship, whether it's our singing, our praying, our teaching, whatever the case may be, we've been given very specific rules,
Yeah.
direction on how to do these things.
Yes.
And this is just one, you've laid out a great example here just with the giving. And we need to be very conscientious
Yeah, and
of all these
Yes.
things.
I think, I remember one time I was in a congregation and the fellows were lined up, the Lord's Supper had been served and the baskets were given out. The fellow reached in his back pocket. He shouldn't have done this anyway. He reached in his back pocket and just thumbed through his wallet and just grabbed something right in front of him. You couldn't help but see it. And it was almost just like he just kind of grabbed something, no plan.
Right.
At least it looked like. And to propose, to set aside, sometimes people think, well, I just missed a service. Or they hadn't been coming frequently, and I have mentioned, as you all know, I've mentioned numbers of times that when people absent themselves from their assembly, it's not just that one thing. They're not singing, they're not teaching, admonishing one another, they're not praying with others, and they're not giving. Usually, there have been a few people I've known who, because of sickness and whatnot, were more housebound and basically sent their contribution to be put in. But a lot of cases that I am very well aware of now are cases where people have been away and they don't put a dollar in. We've got a responsibility along those lines to honor the Lord with our presence, with our worship, to worship Him as described, and then to help the work and provide for things that the Lord describes in the Word. Anyway, you look like you want to say something else.
I just know there are a lot of these big denominational institutions that will send you a bill
Yes.
for your 10%.
Yes.
They still use
The tithe. Mm-hmm. They
designation, and you can pay with credit card.
yes, pay with credit
online.
card. I can swipe your card, or that opens up a lot of questions. One quick thing I want to mention. The Jews were more of an agrarian society, and they would tithe the firstling of the flock. They would tithe the crops. It's been variously estimated by some Old Testament scholars that the Jews gave anywhere from 25 to 35% of, if you look at the composite of all that they did, all they made, their livestock, their fruits and vegetables and everything else, that it would have been a whole lot. And somebody, I've had this question, where do you think I ought to start? I think a person ought to start at 10% and go up from there. And don't be like the fellow said, he was asked how much you give. He said, but Jesus said, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, they gave a tenth, we ought to give at least a 20th. You got that just reversed. All right, let's move on now. We've come to the time here. We've gone through the things that have been happening on Tuesday of the last day of the Lord's ministry on earth. Entrapment questions answered, his unanswerable question, and the woes, the widow's mites, and now the destruction of Jerusalem and the end of time. Jesus is really through with his final discourses, and he and some others are beginning to go out. They're going to go down into the Kidron Valley, and then they're going to come up on the Mount of Olives. And as they start to go out, he has Peter, Andrew, James, and John with him in Mark's account, not in Matthew's account. And they call his attention to the grandeur of the structures. I was reading where, we made the point that the Temple Mount was about 40 acres. It's variously estimated that the temple and its buildings that surround it took around 19 to 20 of that. So it's huge. And then you have the massive stones for the wall. And so they just call attention to the Lord, the beauty of this. And then it's almost, as a matter of fact, kind of a casual statement, it seems like. He said, well, let me tell you that not one stone is going to be standing upon another stone. Everything will be cast down. And so then they go down in the Kidron and they come up on the Mount of Olives and they sit down. And that's when the disciples said, well, Lord, when is that going to be? What will be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? And then that gives really is the introduction to the whole speech that he gives here, the destruction of Jerusalem. And I believe that in Matthew, even in parts of Matthew 24, that he goes on to describe how really the destruction of Jerusalem becomes a figure or a precursor of the second coming and ultimate judgment in these passages. So the circumstances, Jesus and the disciples leave the temple. They descend into the Kidron Valley, an observation of the temple's grandeur. And then not one stone will be on another that's not thrown down. So when will these things be? What shall be the sign? What kind of signs will come to that? And of the end of the world. We'll come back to that. Here's kind of an overhead. Here's the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives. And if you descend into the Kidron and ascend the Mount of Olives, you'll be in a position where you can actually look over the wall and see the temple itself. And so somewhere here on the mount is where Jesus gives this discourse. Sometimes it's called the Olivet Discourse because on the Mount of Olives, and we see that. Here I want to show you just a picture or two. The Western Wall, for centuries revered by Jews as the only remaining wall of the ancient temple area. It's the retaining wall built by Herod to support earthworks extending the width of the Temple Mount. Today it's still a place of pilgrimage. Jesus' words about the destruction of the temple came true in AD 70 when it was razed by the Romans. The Arch of Titus in Rome shows Roman soldiers carrying off the temple furnishings. You can see that in that relief. Here is remains of the upper lintel of the Hall Gate, one of the main entrances to Herod's temple. Just part of it is there. Huge stones from the retaining wall surrounding Herod's temple cast down. It's interesting, when we were there in 2009, a lot, you could just see it was like, okay, wonder why, what's the construction process doing here? Why they have all that? They've left it there as a reminder of these very words of Jesus. And here are marble paving stones found on the western side of the temple. The tumbled stones over here date from the temple's destruction. And so that's where we are. And this is pretty much the outline you see in your booklet. Let's do this. One thing I wanted to do with you, let's turn briefly to Mark and Luke's account first. Matthew 24 is the lengthiest of the accounts. But turn over to Mark 13. Oftentimes, some brethren have used Mark and Luke's account to indicate that Matthew 24 says nothing about the second coming of Christ or the final judgment, but only about the destruction of Jerusalem. And they allow Mark and Luke to kind of explain Matthew. But you'll notice, and I'll say this, that I believe the majority of Matthew 24 does describe the destruction of Jerusalem. But I think there's a transition in it where he begins to describe the other. In Mark, the 13th chapter, if you'll notice in verse 3, as he sat on the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when these things are all about to be accomplished?" Now, that question obviously and specifically refers to the destruction of the temple, destruction of Jerusalem. Right? And then Jesus goes on from there. Look at Luke's account. look at Luke 21. You'll see a little difference in what the emphasis is in each. In chapter 21, verse 5 is where this very conversation begins. They spoke of the goodly stones and how they were adorned. And then Jesus says, not one stone is going to stand upon another. They'll all be thrown down. Verse 6. In verse 7, they ask him, saying, Teacher, when therefore shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when these things are about to come to pass? So it seems limited to what? The destruction of Jerusalem. But now turn to Matthew 24. Turn back to Matthew 24. Same thing. They call attention to Jesus concerning the beauty of the stones and the beauty of the temple. And then Jesus makes comment into verse 2, there shall not be left here one stone upon another. Then in verse 3, as they sat on the Mount of Olives, they said, Tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the what? End of the world. That last phrase, and of the end of the world, that's only mentioned by Matthew, not by Mark and Luke. It could very well be that the second and third questions of Matthew could be kind of pressed together as one. And so you have, what are the signs, and when is this going to be? And it could be that the idea that they think, for as massive as the temple is and the complex around it, as huge as these stones are, for one stone not to be on another, that just must be the end of everything. And so it could be that is, you have kind of a compound question in the second and third. Now, the first part of the question is, when shall these things be? When are these stones going to be turned over? And then, what will be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Here's the easy way to look at it. When are these things going to be? All right, Jesus then addresses the questions in the order they were asked in Matthew 24. When will these things be? All right, he says there are going to be a lot of false signs. Don't follow them. Then he gives them true signs that will anticipate the destruction of Jerusalem. Be careful, listen out for them. And then there's a transition in, I think, 29 through about 35. And he says, this generation shall not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. But then he says in 36, but of that day and hour knoweth no man. And so it looks like to me that is the shift. Now, when he says that from then on he begins to talk about the second coming, Judgment Day. However, there is a mixture of language, and if you notice in Matthew 24 verses 29 and through 31, there's a mixture of language that looks like he could, that one could kind of follow the other. And in prophecies, there are oftentimes, we've studied the prophets together enough for all of us know this, that oftentimes in the prophets, you will have compacted in a few verses, maybe two kinds of judgments. We know in Isaiah 40 through the end, that sometimes he has the return from Babylonian captivity in mind, but then he has a secondary return also, and that's the return that people will have from sin to the Messiah in the Messianic age. And sometimes they're blended. It looks like to me, I just throw all this out for you because we'll get to it in a second, but it looks like to me that he answers the immediate questions about when will Jerusalem be destroyed. Okay, you're going to have false signs, there will be things that will happen, the gospel will be preached to the whole world, then the end comes, and these are signs you can know. And then he shifts gears in verse 35. Notice what he says there. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day and hour. In other words, what I've been talking about is a certainty. It is going to happen. But of that day and hour, that is when I come in judgment on the whole world, nobody knows, not even the Son, nor the angels, but the Father only. And then he gives ideas on that. There's another thing, too, that you'll notice. Several years ago, I highlighted the word days, plural. The word days is used in the first 31 verses. Days. Except those days. I'm looking down at verse 19. Woe unto them that are sick with child, and to them that give suck in those days. Down in verse 22, and except those days had been shortened. Those days shall be shortened. Verse 22. Verse 29, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. And then you'll notice the word know, K-N-O-W. You can know these things. Look at verse 32. You know that the summer is nigh. You see all these things. Verse 33, know that he is nigh. You know these things. But then if you'll notice in verse 36, he shifts from days to what? But of that day. And know versus knoweth no one. Verse 39, they knew not until the flood came. Verse 42, watch therefore, for you know not on what day your Lord comes. It's almost like he said there are days, and you can know. You can know these days, and this is what you can expect. But of that day and hour knoweth no one. So things you can know, things you can't know. Days preceding the destruction of Jerusalem, then the day of the Lord. Now, in one sense, Jesus is shown to be in the day of the Lord in both. It's the day of the Lord in the sense that it's the judgment on Jerusalem. But it's also the day of the Lord, as we've studied all through the Old Testament. Day of the Lord is not final judgment every time you read it. Day of the Lord here is you'll see the Son of Man coming on the throne of his Lord. It's in judgment on Jerusalem. But there's that ultimate day of the Lord in judgment. Does that make sense to everybody? So you got some blending of prophecies here. We've got to stop, and I hate to do it right now, but our time is shot. Any last comment? David, you look like you wanted to say something. Anyone? Well, kind of an introductory comment on those passages. Lord willing, we'll get into them on Wednesday night and try to get through. I think I don't know the passage that's more misused and abused in Matthew 24. People make it to try to get that what Jesus was talking about, we know specifically about the destruction of Jerusalem, and say, well, you know, there's wars and rumors of wars, and here's Ukraine, and there's famines in places, earthquakes in diverse places. All these things are, well, yeah, but he's specifically answering their question. And they just completely fail to put it in its context and make it apply to the premillennial slants on most of it. Okay, any other comments?